let's just see where the conversation goes, was the last thing Thomas said to me. Good morning, everybody. This is Perry from the Octopus movement in a conversation with Thomas about many things. Thomas, I'm not going to say about indigenous nonlinear thinking or Christ says or Christ is, but many things. Hi, Thomas. How are you today?
I'm good, Perry. Thanks for having me. I'm curious. As I said, I'm curious where the conversation goes. So it's always exciting to talk to you. So let's see where it takes us today.
I want to start with a part of a sentence that I saw in your book. Your book,
Okay.
this book that you sent to me, Beyond Crisis. Thank you for sharing this with me. So interesting to read, especially your personal note. Of course, it's all personal, but the very personal notes that is in a different letter type as well, um, in your experiences all over the world. And I would love to talk about that because while reading your book, I was craving for more. Tell me more about Kabul, right? Tell me more about. So let's talk about that. But one sentence I thought was was so good, and maybe that's also a title of a new book for you. A driver is never just a driver. I thought that was so true, right?
Mhm.
Can you explain that for people watching us? What the hell is Perry talking about? A driver is not just a driver. What do you mean with a driver is never just a driver in your book and in your experience in life?
In my experience, well, these are almost two different things, although they're connected. But starting with why a driver is never just a driver. In the humanitarian aid or humanitarian response or humanitarian world, however you want to call it, where I worked for 15 years of my career, we often go into contexts that are either war torn or have just experienced the disaster. And coming in there as a foreigner, you still need to get around somehow. And it's very often contexts that either are dangerous or where it's difficult to drive or where you don't know your way around. So a lot of these organizations, people like me that come in or that work there, are dependent on drivers, people that drive you around. And I was given this advice already before I went there, but I didn't understand how before I met my first driver what it meant. So somebody told me before I went to the field, like, and remember, the driver will be one of the most important people that you will ever meet there. And it was really the drivers that I worked with. I was incredibly lucky. They were, apart from the fact that they were incredible people, they had stories, they had families. They are not just a driver that sits there and takes it from A to B, but they're also, beyond all that, they're exceptionally resourceful. They know the place, they know the people. They were more than once, they got us out, or me particularly got me out of very difficult situations because of their knowledge, because of their way of handling the situation, their resourcefulness. So it's never just a function that anybody has, and that goes for drivers as well as for any other function. We're all people behind it. We all have a wealth of knowledge, experience, resources. So it's very, very important to not forget that one thing is a function, and in this case it was a driver, but that's the same for others. But there's also people behind it, so that's
And
important to see.
I loved it that the driver is, I think, a symbol in our lives as well. I know exactly what you mean because um, when I went to China to live in China, we had a driver as well. You can't drive yourself in China unless you have your own Chinese driving license,
Hmm.
which I have. Anyway, um, the driver is everything. So and what I love about the driver is that you don't know he or she is everything until later in time.
Mhm.
It's never you get in the car and then the driver tells you everything. It doesn't work that way.
No.
So for me, a driver is such a interesting symbol into life, that the driver is everything. He's there or she driving the car, bringing you from A to B, knowing so much, right?
Mm.
and and will only speak out when you really need them. And they they have a lot of wisdom and knowledge and just share with you, we could do this, or
Mhm.
maybe it's better to do it this way or that way. The driver is very cool. What did you do, Thomas? Was it the United Nations? Where did you work? How did you travel the world?
I worked a bit all over the place. I started off with a internship in South Africa. So that was by pure coincidence a person I met in a training who ran a local NGO there, and we were joking about me coming there to do an internship, and that's how my career in a way started, because he followed up a few months later. So I found myself in South Africa. Still to this day, it was an unpaid job, but still the best job I've ever had. It was just so close to the people. I was free of any preconceptions. I was just a curious mind, and I had a lot of freedom. So I was traveling a lot within South Africa. So I got to places where they weren't seeing so many white people, and these were also very, very, very special moments. And then it was just once you are in the field, it's basically it's an opportunity based. How should I say, an opportunity based sector, so to say. You get next job was in Afghanistan. I worked there for a German organization. After a while, I got an offer for another organization, and so these are all short-term contracts, but they're also, there's unfortunately enough crises and disasters that you in a way will never run out of a job. That's the one thing. But the other thing is also that you really evolve. For me, the advantage was I worked for different organizations, including the UN, including the Red Cross family. So I had very different perspectives on the work that they do, because every organization, even though they might all seem the same, they have a very different perspective on things, a different mandate, and a different focus. So I learned a lot in those years and got me around a bit.
How would you define yourself if someone would ask you, Thomas, what do you do? And us nonlinear thinkers who are all over the place hate that question, but I'm curious, what would you answer if someone comes up to you and say, well, hey, Thomas, that's been a while, what are you doing today? What's
Thank you
happening?
for saying that we hate that question, because I actually do hate that question.
I know.
I would answer always very, very broadly. I'm saying like, well, first of all, I'm a constant learner, but then I've also learned to share what I've learned. So I think what I do is I pass on the skills that I've had, whether it's individually or collectively, but not in the sense of teaching, but in the sense of sharing. So really just giving people perspectives on their situations, giving them ideas for how they could solve problems, share my skills as I do in the book. And I do this for facilitation. So in the linear world, I'm a facilitator. Basically, I create spaces, I create processes, I create methods for people to tackle problems, to address them, and to, in the process, develop skills and resources themselves.
Why are you doing this?
Because I love people. I think I've always been doing this without putting a label on it. I've always loved people, because this is what I thrive off. Whether it's my observation of the dynamics, or whether it's experiencing dynamics. And I come originally from a conflict resolution background. So this was the first thing that fascinated me about people. How do we end up in conflicts, knowing that we kind of have to do this in a way together, but we keep repeating this. And over the years, then I understood that it's a natural part of us. It's just the way we're dealing with it that is often very destructive. It's not the conflict itself that's the problem. And this has got me a little bit into this whole observing human dynamics. And this is also where the Indigenous people come in, because I was lucky enough to spend time and work with Indigenous people in almost all continents. And that's just opened for me such a wide world, because they are nonlinear thinkers. They're per default nonlinear thinkers. And that's also why they struggle so often with the Western concepts, because they don't see it that way.
Isn't that the explanation immediately, that the Western world is very linear and the Indigenous people are very nonlinear? Because the basic mind of a human being, the basic brain of a human being is very nonlinear, and until we go to school and until we go into the Western world with all our methods and systems. How do you see that? And first of all, let me ask you this: Indigenous people. What are Indigenous people to you?
There's definitions about what Indigenous people are, and I think this is a great question. For me, these are people that have been there, that have had a steady involvement, but that are focused on not so much about their own development, but have a respect, understand that they're just a part of a bigger thing. So they're basically just one little element of a very, very, very big cosmos, or however you want to label it. And Indigenous people, for me, are the people that have been occupying land or have been settled at a certain place and have not really adjusted their lifestyle based on external pressure so much, but they really they shape their own beliefs, they try to continue their own traditions, and are not prone to things that we are prone to, which is faster, higher, longer, wider, all these terms like more, for them it was
Better,
really
bigger,
better,
faster.
bigger. I mean, you
Yeah.
name it, right? And for
Yeah.
Indigenous people, it's about survival. It's more about preservation than it is actually about evolvement. And this is my definition. There's other definitions which are more technical, but this is the way I see it. And
Have you ever considered the option of living with Indigenous people? Because
oh yeah,
I've read your book, and
yeah,
I
yeah.
loved the way you balanced and you danced with linear thinking and nonlinear thinking.
Mhm.
For me, as a nonlinear thinker, I was laughing because I was reading your linear thoughts. This is the method, this is how, and then you jump almost every time you explain something in a linear way, you end with a nonlinear perception of everything, right?
Yeah.
And I love that it's very interesting to read that, to see that constant dance between linear and nonlinear thinking. But now the question is, have you ever considered living with Indigenous people? Do you say, okay, I want to be a part of this tribe, I want to live here because it's so much closer to my own beliefs and values rather than the Western world with their linear thinking?
I have at times. And for me, I think I'm probably a bit drifter between realities here. So I would have also understood that there is limited insight. If I'm not born into this, into this thinking, into this approach, that, for example, I mean, they all have very similar approaches to what I've seen and very similar images of the world, but still there's differences to who these people are, right? So if I understood that not being born or growing up with that kind of thinking from basics, I would have also had that limitation. I would have eventually hit my wall where my understanding, my immersion into their life would have been stopped. At the same time, I'm also I love this dance, and thank you very much for pointing this out. In a way, this was also the idea in that book, because this is how I function. So I love the dance between the realities, because I do think there's something in both of them, and this is also in a way a balance. And this is what all Indigenous people have in common. They have this thought about balance. Right? There's a lot of their worlds are quite dual, right? There's a bit the yin and yang thought, but in different contexts, and these need to be in balance. So I do think non-linear thinking needs linear thinking and the other way around. So if I'm able to balance between them, it's great. So yes, it would have been great to live with them for a little while, and I did here and there, but not as long as I wanted. But still getting these insights into their cultures, the little insights and the few insights that I got were just a privilege. So I take that with me.
Take us with you. Let's fly away and go to an example of living for a short period of time with some Indigenous people or an Indigenous tribe where you've encountered something really beautiful that you keep with you in your mind.
Well, I'm not
Every
getting
day.
tired. I'm not getting tired of sharing my life-changing story. It was with the Aborigines in Australia, or the Aboriginal people, to be precise. It was really the bad moment in my life where I was very demotivated. I was disillusioned. I just come out of Afghanistan after 2.5 years working there. So basically, I dropped from all the time adrenaline to no adrenaline, right? So it was very difficult to get up from the sofa and really motivate myself to do anything. So I Googled as one does back then already. And I Googled and I came across this, it's called Traditional Leadership and Mediation Training on an island called Alco Island, which when I Googled found that it was an hour north of Australia, a very little island, inhabited only by Aboriginal people and a sober community, since lots of Aboriginal people around the world have the same issue with alcohol, drugs that they were that they encountered when encountering the more modern world. This community was sober, however, and they have started, the elders have decided the way to make us better understood in Australia is to open up and actually let people into our lives and try to explain them a little bit what's going on. So they had entered a partnership with Darwin University in Australia for a master's program called Masters in Indigenous Knowledge. Now, this is just the background, because this was an individual standalone training. So I applied. I sent them an application. The elders in the community were the ones to decide, and I was already way past the deadline, so I thought I will never hear from them. But to my surprise, I was accepted. But that was not it, because when I decided to go there, I found out that I was the only non-Australian. And how that happened is because I'm from Austria, and on my application they didn't read this properly. So they thought that's how I ended up there.
That was a surprise when you came up there, right?
And I just took this as a sign from the universe, right? I mean, great. So I took it for what it was, and it was in a way enriching, because I had a completely outside perspective, because there was, of course, Australians, right? White Australians primarily. There were the Aboriginal people, and then there was me who knew very little. I knew a little bit about their struggles, but not so much. Anyway, the only rule that we got was don't ask questions. It's not allowed to ask questions. And of course, this is already for us linear thinkers, as we brought up, right? Very difficult. You don't know something, you ask. So we kept asking, because we understood nothing about what was happening there. And constantly we were reminded, no questions. Observe, listen, learn. So this is the way we do it here. You observe, you listen, and you learn. And the first few days were a nightmare. People were really about like, I want to leave again. I invested in this, and I'm not getting anything out. And after 3-4 days, the magic happened. Because if you don't get answers from around you, there's only one place left to look. And that's inside you. So people just turned into this reflective mode and said, like, okay, the Aboriginal people don't tell me what they think leadership is. Nobody tells me this. What do I actually think what leadership is? So you really went into this complete reflection mode, self-focus. You got a lot of clarity on different concepts, different things that you just threw around, right? And what happened afterwards was an exchange. So it was not, I need to convince you that this is the right way, but we actually just shared our insights. Oh, this is what I discovered about myself, and this is what you discovered about yourself. So I like that. I take that with me. So it became this, it's almost like a stock market for insights, if you want. And on week number two, there was a ritual. And this was the conflict resolution part, but it was not just a ritual. It was really it was a completely life-changing experience, because we were called into the bush and told to undress, and then we were given like this little cloth, and we heard already a rhythm that was constantly played and some singing outside the bush. And then, we were supposed to dress ourselves and paint ourselves and everything. And then we were told, so now you have to dance. We were like, wanted to ask questions, of course, have learned better, but we were like, yeah, nobody told us a dance or anything. So we went out, and there were like 1,000 people sitting, could be 2,000, I don't know, but a lot of people. And we had to dance, because the elders collect these rhythms, and to each rhythm there was a dance that we didn't know. Some younger Aboriginal people knew that, they were in the first row, but we had to dance them. And this went on for 6 to 8 hours for 5 days in a row. And the rhythm would only change if the elders were happy with how much in sync we were. So the idea was to be in full sync, all 40, 50 people that we were. The second idea was to come to the front line, so that you're ready to lead this, and not only observe, but you are ready to take the next step. So you would have to really absorb the dance first, and then just completely focus on yourself. You had to forget who's around you. You had to forget what this is about. You had to forget like the expectations, the people laughing and everything, your own embarrassment. This all didn't matter. You completely got lost in that experience. And at the end of the day, we would just sit down and we would eat our food in silence. And then they would tell us, now access all the negative emotions of ongoing conflicts you have. Negative perspectives, feelings, take them, acknowledge them, and then symbolically give them back to where they came from, which is the earth. And then that was represented by the food. And it was incredibly easy to access those feelings, because you were so much in a self-reflective mode that you were like, there were no barriers, there were no questions. You could almost grab them. Oh, this is my anger, this is my disappointment, these are my needs. And so basically your inner side was completely open. And just this way of thinking, this way of putting yourself and the collective together, it wasn't just, you would only function the collective would only function if you as an individual contribute. And that was beautifully symbolized by this dance. But also I had a responsibility to help the collective. So it was both sides. And that balance and that synergy was a life-changing moment for me.
Wow. That's really cool. Right. And how long ago was this?
This was now 10 years ago. Yeah. I think next year it's 10 years. And what's the interesting thing is that what I'm telling now is still probably only a fraction of what really happened those couple of weeks, because it took me years to understand what had happened to me. So it took me years to understand what I had experienced there, what privilege I've had, but also what messages I took away from that. And in a way that shaped, when I said before, I like to teach in a way, but not as a teacher, but as a, sharing and challenging people to learn and reflect. It's more about, I want to create arenas where they can experience a little bit of what I've experienced there and find their own confidence in their own perspectives. Mm-hmm. So for me, it's not about like mine is the right perspective. It's like, well, we all have perspectives. Let's just explore them, and let's not be too quick to ask and follow this. Like, when you don't know, you ask. It's like, no, when you don't know, you tell. And I do this with my children, for example.
When you don't know, shut the fuck up and look inside.
My kids, when they ask me, right? I ask them back first, because they say,
how annoying! What a father are you?
Why is the sky blue? It's like, okay, tell me, why do you think the sky is blue? Yeah. Because I don't want to give them the feeling that their opinion doesn't matter. And it's like, even if I just want to hear what they think as well, because maybe I learned something. So it's a little bit this back and forth, and not being too quick in like, no, this is why it is, because it mirrors the sea. Okay, great. But I took
why it's so beautiful. It goes, of course, it's so nonlinear, your experience there, because it's the opposite of the linear experience we have in education in our world, right? Where there is a good and a bad answer. It's right or wrong.
Yeah.
It's A or B or C or D, and that's it. And you have to do it yourself, and you don't work with, and that's not, some people are writing posts about this. This is, the educational system isn't preparing us for the future, because that's not how it works, right? You're not just there by yourself, and there is no good or bad. There are always multiple answers. There are always multiple possibilities.
And this is also why I wrote, for example, in my book, I don't believe in the right or wrong when it comes to crisis management and making a decision. I don't believe in right or wrong. It's, you make a decision, and then you deal with the consequences. But you can't say it's a wrong decision just because you don't like the outcome of it. Because that's also misplaced. You didn't know the outcome of it before, so judging it in retrospect is a little bit flawed. And when it comes to the experience, what I also I explored a bit whether this is just, they're doing this just with us, or whether this is also this is basically how they educate the youth in this Aboriginal community. And it was, it's there's no questions are looked upon as a bit as invasive, and almost a bit like giving away the responsibility. Like, you have a responsibility also to find these out for yourself and develop the universe in your head. It's not my universe that you're developing, it's yours. And through your observation, you can put the puzzle pieces together that are relevant for you. And I really like that. I just, that spoke to me so much, because it's giving me freedom, but it's also in a way giving me guidance, without really directing me where I need to go. It's just these frames within I can move, so this duality and these places, and they fall into place when I get older, but I'm not told immediately how that works, just to take away all my my answers that I might have myself.
You know what also triggers with me when I listen to you to this story is that a lot of people in our Western society use questions to promote their own intelligence
Mhm.
in a way, which is very annoying, right? They have to ask. Some people, the default mode option in life is to ask questions
Mm.
so they can illustrate how tremendously clever they are, how high their intellect is by asking questions.
I find question a tricky thing, because I have 2 years ago I did a workshop on the power of not asking questions, and it was of course inspired by this experience. But I did it with the facilitator community, which is known for no asking a lot of questions, where it's also really the narrative, like you have to ask good questions to get the people going. So I did a whole workshop with the same rule. It's only one rule here: you're not allowed to ask questions. And people were amazed on how well this went, because they couldn't imagine doing it. And I said, like, we're not aware of how often we ask a question that could easily be a statement,
Definitely.
just for simplicity's sake. And the other thing that I challenge when it comes to questions, they by default create a power dynamic.
Yeah,
So
definitely.
if I ask a question, I'm automatically in a power position, because I give you a few options. You answer, so you give in to my request whether you want it or not. You deny me, reject me, which is also not a nice feeling. The spotlight is either way on you, and then I'm just like, yeah. So what do you do with my question now? And often they come uninvited. And I'm not saying they're all bad, right? Again, this balance. I think questions have their advantage, but I think we don't reflect enough on how much danger there is to the concept of questions. And that's
And again, because of education in our system, we're trained to answer the question. But this is what I always find very interesting.
Yeah.
When someone asks a question, your automatic pilot answers the question, even if you don't like it or not. If you do a media training, you learn how not to give answer to the questions, right?
Yeah,
And
exactly. You evade
how
it.
to bend them into something else, which is very annoying with politicians, that they never answer the
Yeah,
question,
you can't grasp them.
right? It's very annoying. But it's fascinating how easily we answer a question, even if we don't want to answer the question, and then later on we're, oh, did I just say that? I didn't want to tell this. It's questions are interesting.
They are a fascinating concept, but they're often also a shield for us, right? I mean, if we don't know what to say anymore, we just throw a question back. I just see a question here, and
Yeah,
curiosity. What about it with questions?
let's talk about this one. It's a good question, Gloria. What about the curiosity? How do you manage that? You want to know something, but you cannot ask any questions. How does it
Well,
work?
the thing is that what do you want to know, right? I want to know how the universe works. Is the same statement as how does the universe work? So it's just, it doesn't always have to be formulated as a question. And I think so because somebody invented questions at one point. We must not forget that. So the curiosity might have been there. And if I look at my kids, because they are my biggest teachers these days, my kids, they don't, before they speak, they're already curious. So maybe their mind thinks in questions, I don't know. But it's more like, let's just see how this works. And I think it's just, for me, it's not, again, as I said before, I'm not on a crusade against questions. I'm just really, I think there's other ways to stimulate both curiosity, to stimulate learning, to stimulate answers. It doesn't always have to be questions. They're a good tool, but they're also, for me, the tendency is that they're a bit overused in some situations.
Well, it's fascinating to be aware of questions to start with, and you created that knowledge in yourself very well, thanks to the Aboriginals, that you're very
It
aware
pushed
of
me, yeah.
a question, right?
Yeah, because I reflected on it. I reflected on how often do I actually use questions when I speak. And it's not, and those are not the targeted questions on how something works. This is more like, would you mind giving me this? And yes, it's a very polite way of asking, but it's also not, why do I have to formulate it as a question? And not drifting off too much in question. That's one concept, and I know my thought on that is very provocative for some, but I just share my experience on it, and it makes people
Yeah, but
think.
it's
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 great.
fascinating. it's fascinating because it's linked also to, you wrote about the survival experts, what I thought was interesting as well. And a survival expert also cannot ask the question when you're in survival mode in the Amazon or whatever, right? You cannot. And maybe that's also why we love Google. We can ask questions to Google. We're so
Yeah.
much focused on asking questions. Well, while we need to be in survival mode ourselves, not only when we're alone in the desert or alone in the rainforest, or we also need to be sometimes in survival mode when we're at home and things are happening around us, in our family, in our own lives, in crisis.
I think what I'm basically promoting is that before we ask others the question, we should ask ourselves, because sometimes we have already answers to the questions that we're asking without knowing it.
Yeah.
And the typical
Which I
example of
think,
that,
that's nonlinear thinking, Thomas.
you're the expert, so I take
No,
it.
no, no. But open up that you also wrote about the sixth sense when you were in Kabul, and you could feel something was happening,
Yeah.
and you cannot really address what was happening, and then a day later you found out lots of things happened that day, and you could feel it. But how do
Yeah.
you feel something like that? It's opening up your brain, your sixth sense, your nonlinear thinking, which is also the case with the survival expert, you say, because it's not that, it's not only a practical skill, but it's also a mindset and a mental
Yeah.
ability, you wrote. It's definitely true, of course.
I stand behind that, because for me it's about not taking things for just what they are and we were told what they can do. And particularly when it comes to these survival experts, or for each of us when it comes to a crisis, it's our biggest enemies are those mental models that we have had for all our lives. And my favorite example is that I wasn't aware of a mental model, basically a very strong assumption how the world works, that I was carrying until I was also in South Africa back then, where I had my first job, sitting down at the table, and then there was this young boy sitting down on the other side of the table, and he was wearing a cap. And I had like all my inner voices were like, you cannot wear a cap at the table. This is not allowed. I heard my father's voice like, don't wear a hat at the table. We don't do this in our house, right? And this was basically just table manners as I was brought up. But they were so strongly rooted in my understanding of how the world works that I hadn't even considered that anybody else could think differently.
Yeah.
And those mental models are we often not aware of them until they're challenged. And in crisis situations, we have to challenge them. When none of what we know and what we can do works, we have to think differently. We have to actually question: does it not work because I cannot relate different options to it, or does it not work because I cannot think beyond of what I'm actually thinking? And most of the time, that's the case. And there's so many examples when things were invented in a crisis situation because we throw overboard everything we knew about those things and just connected different dots. And
For
that's
me,
when we came out and through with it.
yeah, for me, those are the unwritten rules in life. I talk about that a lot. I was triggered once. I was inspired doing an interview with someone with autism, and I asked him, I said, what do you want to change in the world? He said, can we change the unwritten rules? They're driving me nuts. And I thought
I love that.
it was so beautiful. And that's exactly what you're talking about now. Wearing a cap at the table at your place, that's the unwritten rule, right? You don't wear a cap when
You
you're
don't
having
do that.
dinner.
Yeah.
You don't do that. That's the rule. That's the unwritten rule. It doesn't exist,
No.
but it's there,
Yeah.
right? And we have so many things in our lives that don't exist but are there and are for real because of the unwritten rules. How complicated is that, right? It's for real, but it's not there, and it's thanks to the unwritten rules.
Well, the idea is the ironic idea is that should make our life a lot easier, because it's almost rule of engagement, right? Rules of engagement. But then coming from different cultures, and then for me, like going back to these indigenous experiences that I've had, I've a wonderful story about a log frame workshop in a logical framework approach workshop in Papua New Guinea that I didn't hold. I was just an observer to the workshop. So there was an instructor from Norway, and Papua New Guinea, for those who don't know the country so well, is basically so it's a peninsula north of Australia, and one could argue that it is still very indigenous, even though they have basically, they have a state system, and there's the state system, and all the systems are very duplications almost from Australia. But you have to imagine that they didn't build it themselves; they just copied it. So there's a lot of tricky things to how maneuver this system. So the political system exists, but at the core of it is still the indigenous thinking that rules. And in this workshop, on the last day, there was basically, for the logical framework approach, for those who the listeners who don't know, you create a lot of boxes, and these boxes are basically, you write something in these boxes, and then you make a logical step in the next box. And this is how you create a program or a project. And on the last day, after 3 days, this training, very intense, everything, the whole walls were full. One participant, a young man from Papua New Guinea, raised his hand and said, like, Miss, I'm just wondering one thing. You're telling us for 3 days how logical this is, but I do not understand why you drop boxes. And she did not understand what he was asking. And he tried to explain. He said, boxes is a bit like a house with a fence around. It divides things. So you tell us now this moves logically over, but in my mind, there's a border between those two. So how are they connected? And it was a wonderful conversation. I just sat there with an open mouth, like, this is a beautiful example of how worldviews and world understandings clash. Because in her world, this was so logical because she didn't take the border, she took the content.
Yeah.
In his world, he was like, well, this is sealed off. How can this move over? This is blocked. There's a border. And it was a fantastic exchange, right? And this just shows that these unwritten rules, these assumptions that we're having, they're not common assumptions. So this common sense and those referrals, they're all, I don't think they really exist in that sense.
And I think what we tend to do in this world, well, everywhere, when something becomes complicated, we want to simplify them. And when we simplify things, we put things in boxes, because that, it
seems, yeah.
It closes up the difficulty, and it simplifies. People love that. I don't love it. You don't love it, but
no. Because I feel it's limiting me, right? I'm also all for simplifying, but not simplifying in the sense of packing it away, but simplifying maybe the approach to it. I'm saying, like, instead of having all the answers, I just try to see what possibilities there are. So approaching it from a different angle, which gives me way less of pressure. I'm just saying, like, the world is my playground in that sense, and I don't have to. That's also why I function. We said before we went live. I mean, I function in chaos. You function in chaos, because those unwritten rules aren't there, and I think this makes it a lot easier for me to create opportunities, because I don't have to consider all these borders that I also see somewhere in between. And I think that often is also the tricky thing with the linear thinkers, because that's sometimes also where it clashes.
And we need that. We're not against linear thinking. We need that, but it's so interesting. Like, we need questions, but how fascinating is it to think about not asking a question and what it means to ask questions? Also, everybody who's listening, go to LinkedIn and follow Thomas, because you listen to your children. And I think that's fascinating, because many people do it the other way around. They want children to listen to their parents and, do exactly as they tell them to do. For me, it feels that you're doing a little bit the opposite. You're listening to your children. You're seeing very inspiration and interesting thoughts with your children, and you share that on LinkedIn in a linear way, which is fascinating. So people follow Thomas. And now I will ask a question. Since we're talking about questions, I didn't ask any questions yet. I'm just
you can ask me.
No. But I was playing with this. I just make a statement, and you respond to the statement instead of a question. Also very, very funny. Now, a serious question: are you going to continue with that, the inspiration of your children, and sharing that on LinkedIn?
Yeah, it's now season 2. I started actually. That started a year ago with my TEDx talk, where we talked about reconnecting, and somehow I had this immediate thought, like reconnecting to our inner child. And then I looked upon my children, and I looked upon them as what do they have to navigate on a daily basis? So they have to navigate uncertainty. They have to navigate a context that for them very often changes with these artificial rules that all of a sudden pop up, boundaries that they have to explore. They deal a lot with, getting to know new people, learning how things work, learning how human dynamics work. So in a way, it's a definition of what we often label as a crisis. Those are all characteristics of crisis. So I just started looking at them and I was like, well, let's see what they do. I mean, they're crisis managers in action, so let's see what they do. This is how it started. And I've since really observed so many skills. And what I love most about this is we've all been children. So we've all done this. And in a way, it's funny. Today I wrote a post about how to set boundaries, right? And the older we get, the more difficult this gets. But it's not difficult for children to set their boundaries. They're very good at that.
Yeah.
And it's just interesting to see where, as we grow older, these skills are challenged. And often it is when parents or when school or when others around try to set them into a frame, right? You cannot do this or you can do this. So this is how we told, right? Or you have to take care of the other person's feelings. Very important. But this doesn't mean the implicit message like you must not care about your own feelings. And this is what it ends up often being. So it's very interesting to really look at them, because there's no more natural learners than children for me on this planet. I mean, they learn. This is what they do since they come into this world, and observing them on how to do it, we can take away so much. Again, like lots of insights from them. And so it's season 2 now, and I'm planning to eventually after this transform that into a book of like 52 lessons, or 1 lesson per week that I observed this past year, and that's the aim.
How old are your kids, Thomas?
8 and 3.
8 and 3. I'm so curious to season number 13 when they're teenagers. I can't wait for that.
Oh my God.
I can't wait for that. That's going to be fascinating.
That is going to be fascinating. Yeah.
To talk with you. Yeah. About
it doesn't run out, right? I mean, sure, when they're adults, yeah. But for me, the reason I'm also doing this is not only to learn and to have kind of smart insights to take away, but it's also to get a guidance on what I need to do as a parent. Because the last thing I want to do is to limit them in how they discover the world. And yes, I want to set that frames that give them protection, but I do not want to tell them like this is how it needs to be. Because
can I say then that you're not creating too many unwritten rules to your kids?
I'm trying not to. And of course it's a balance, right? It's always a balance, because they still move in a linear system.
Yeah.
This is how it is. So
trust me, the school will take care of that. As a parent, you don't have to do anything. The school will take care of the linear system, right? And I was also triggered listening to you with your kids that almost our kids are the indigenous people of our own family in the beginning, until they grow up, and unfortunately, and some of us nonlinear thinkers, our brains are wired differently, that they stay a bit indigenous. How inspirational, right?
And I think this is also my current ambition, right? Because I do feel that the past 15, 16, 17 years, I have given a lot of space to my linear side. And I haven't given much space to my nonlinear side. But it was the nonlinear side that was always breaking out. Like when I was like, okay, I can't do this anymore, so I leave this job. And now I understand why. I haven't understood along the way. And so for me, it's really this, I want to explore more of that as well. So having these two teaching me that, and also, this, they see the world in a special way. So learning this and getting reminded of that and of the options and opportunities is also as an adult nice, because with all the weight that, whether it's bills or anything else that comes on top of it, having like a little bit of that glimpse now. But these are the things that are important to me. This is what drives me, and for me they lie all on the nonlinear side, as I've discovered it now.
Yeah. Wow. How cool. How cool you're a founding member of the Octopus movement, Tom.
Oh, this is
how cool you're on board and you're in the family. I love that. Thank you for that.
Thank you for the Octopus movement. I think was a much needed, or is a much needed place to start. and make this topic more actually a topic, because it's been, I wouldn't say it's been dismissed, but it's been ignored. I don't think people were able to kind of grasp it around what it actually means, and that it's not so dangerous as it might sound to some of them. And I think it's great to have a movement like that. And the wonderful people that you collect in it is just inspiring.
Yeah, I agree. Not being happy. Of course, I'm happy I created the Octopus, but it's the beautiful people that are in the movement, like yourself. People who are writing books that I hold it like this. Beyond Crisis, they can order it online of Thomas. It's interesting. People forget the word crisis. This is about life. This is, of course, life is a crisis. It's interesting to read this. I love your personal stories in the book. Immediately I was thinking, Thomas, can you write more about that? Can you write more about your staying with the indigenous people all over the world, being in Kabul? What happened? You know, what did you see? I would love to know more. And I would love to have a book about your kids as well. All these lessons that will come, of course.
That will
it's
come.
there.
Yeah.
It's there on LinkedIn. Follow Thomas on LinkedIn. You can find it all there. Thank you, everybody, for being with us. Very cool. Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you. Thank you, Perry. Thank you, everybody, for the questions, comments, and listening in. Looking forward to connecting, and yeah, who knows what becomes of this.
Reach out to Thomas, and wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for watching us.
Bye.
See you soon.